Well, good morning, everyone. Glad to be able to be with you this morning. David said I'm going to be preaching at the convention next week, which is true, but it's not the same message as this because that is a sermon. This is a talk. We're going to be talking about some data, surveys, things that we're seeing out in the landscape as we look to the future. And just so you know, my goal here is not to give you a to-do list that you walk out with and that you're like, oh, if we do these 4 things, we're going to solve discipleship in the post-COVID era. My goal today is to offer some insights, some surveys, some things that we're seeing across the country to stimulate some thinking on your part so that you can see how best to apply that in the particular context that God has put you in. A couple of months ago, I wrote an article about how the Christian tradition is a castle, not a cabin. Because I do think sometimes that when we see the threat of secularism, we see the rise of anti-Christian sentiments that are out there, we as believers sometimes can have a bit of what I would call like an inferiority complex, like where we kind of feel like, well, we're over here in our little cabin trying to do our thing with a nice little fireplace, and out here you've got these massive edifice of whatever it might be, what atheists say or what different religions say or what secularists say or whatnot. But if you actually look at what we have in the Christian tradition, and if you actually watch what's happening around the world in a lot of really interesting ways, there are secular people who are rethinking their disbelief in God. There's new books that are actually showing that kind of the new atheism is kind of dead, and there are people that are open to all kinds of spirituality and all kinds of things that even if they haven't gotten all the way to Christ and Christianity, they're at least open to some kind of faith. And so my point with that article was just to remind Christians that we have this massive, wonderful inheritance. We really do. We're the ones in the castle, not a little cabin. But there's another way that that analogy of thinking of the church or thinking of what we've been given, what has been passed down to us as a castle is really helpful. And that's in the fact that castles weather the storms that take place over time. They weather the storms. And one of the things I think it's important for us to remember, and one of the reasons that I think we're all here gathered at this particular meeting, is that we probably feel like we're in the middle of a storm right now. And I think it's true. This is such a strange moment in ministry that we are experiencing these days. I talk to pastors and church leaders around the country, and I get to hear these unique challenges that people are facing that a lot of pastors never expected to face before. I had a dime for every time a pastor would tell me there was no seminary class on this particular thing that they're focusing on. The word unprecedented gets thrown around a lot these days, and it can be overused sometimes. But I do think there is something about the combination of challenges that are facing us in this moment that really do make ministry more complicated than it has been in the past. But I still wouldn't want to leave anyone with the impression, though, that these new challenges could somehow sink our efforts to share the gospel and to make disciples. And just like the church in ages past that has faced all sorts of challenges and unprecedented times, we trust in the God who established his church. We ask for his help in fortifying the walls of the castle that we've inherited. So what does this look like? Well, like I said, not going to have like a list of, a 4-step list of things to do coming out of this. We're going to look this morning at we're going to look again at what it is, what God has called us to do in regards to discipleship. What does it mean for us to make disciples? And then we're also going to look at what does it mean for us to really recapture a vision, to reestablish the local church as an institution that needs to be fortified, strengthened for the days ahead. To recover discipleship in a post-COVID world, we've got to regain a vision of what it means for the church to be healthy. for the church to be strong as an institution. And along those lines, I want us to look at, we've got to be really clear about some of the challenges that are facing us, okay? So the first one that I want to point out is the anti-institutional ethos in society. We have to recognize that this is a challenge. It's just, for many people in our society today, there is an anti-institutional bent. Research shows that many institutions, not just the church, are facing fallout in terms of institutional trust. So I'll give you some bad news and good news. The bad news is that trust in the church as an institution has plummeted over the last 30 years. If you look at the Gallup survey, more than 30 percentage points in the last 5 centuries. So that's the bad news. The trust in the church as an institution is significantly lower than it was a few decades ago. Here's the good news. It's also lower for every other institution in society. Like, none of them are doing better than they were. From everyone, from like small business to the military even, and don't even have to look at politics and Congress to see an institution or the trust is at all-time lows. So the bad news is the church is facing a lack of institutional trust. The good news is it's not an outlier. This is true for every institution in society right now, but that does create challenges for pastoral ministry, does it not? I mean, it means pastoral ministry doesn't come with any prestige. There is no built-in sense of trust that comes along with your calling. There's just not. Everything has to be earned. You can't walk into any environment and assume respect or assume trust. And there's another aspect of this anti-institutional ethos. In this kind of world, we tend to think of freedom as escaping from individual or from institutional constraints. So we tend to think of institutions in the sense of, can I take an institution and can it be, something of a platform for me rather than something that I would mold myself to or shape or seek the good of, or the community in which the institution is present. And so what's happened when it comes to religion is, there's a cultural observer, Tara Isabella Burton, who says, we've moved from institutional religion to intuitional religion. So it's less about the institution and more about the intuition. How do I feel about faith? What kind of spirituality do I want to pursue on my own, apart from organized religion or institutional religion? And I think we see that happening. So the interesting thing about secularism today is not that people are moving away from spirituality. It's generally that they're finding some kind of spirituality outside of the traditional channels or forms. And so what happens is, it doesn't matter really to a lot of people in our society what church you belong to. What really matters is if you can remix and rematch and sort of cobble together whatever version of spirituality is going to help you along in life. So it's an intuitional approach that often is set in opposition to the institution of the church. And that is a challenge because we are all about the church, right? The mission. And we want to see churches planted. We want to see people reach. We want to see we want to see the body of Christ healthy. So that's a first challenge. A second challenge that we're facing today is the de-churching of America. It's a shift in de-churching. So there's a new book from some friends of mine, The Great De-Churching, in case you're interested or you may have heard of this book. But it's exploring how we really in the United States today are undergoing the largest religious shift in our history. And really since 2000, we have seen a radical decrease of people regularly attending church or belonging to a congregation. And then there's also the pandemic, which has led to a decrease in programs and ministries. And we've shifted to a new normal in some sense. But I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. I will recommend, I have a podcast called Reconstructing Faith. And the second episode of this season, the second season, is called The Great De-Churching. And it's about 55 minutes of conversation with some of the authors from the book and just talking about this. So, but I do think this is a big challenge, just to recognize that this is happening. A third challenge that pastors are facing is disorientation and division politically. There has been a rise in, partisan hostility over the past 2 decades. And I actually think this is related to number 2. So if the second big challenge is the de-churching of America, and then the third is disorientation and division politically, you say, what does that have to do with each other? Well, as religiosity decreases, the fervency in politics increases. When eternal stakes are lowered, earthly stakes are raised. And so for many people in our society today, politics is their religion. So, and you can see this from on the right, you can see it on the left, you can see it with the level of something of just a widespread intolerance or even incapacity to even understand where someone from another perspective may be coming from, because that person is the heretic, the enemy. And so what happens is in a situation like this, it's not that religiosity disappears, it's that it gets transposed onto politics. And so this is why, there's the rise of the cancel culture. And, it's almost like, you see on social media, it's almost like burn the heretic at the stake. Thankfully not doing that literally, but in a sense in which when you see this kind of action, you realize there's a religious fervor there, even among many secular people. And so here's what pastors are facing in that kind of environment. Our people in our churches are formed at some level by that shift that's happening societally. So you can say the exact same thing you said 10 years ago about racial reconciliation and justice, and now you'd be called woke. You could say the exact same thing 10 years ago that you said about a Christian sexual ethic or about religious liberty, and you'll be called a bigot, right? Because what's happened, because we've seen this shift that has taken place politically where everything now has a signal that takes us back to not the spiritual battlefield that we are actually called to be part of, but the earthly battlefield that has sucked up so much of our time and attention. So, those are 3 challenges that we are facing. But I want to just remind us quickly what hasn't changed. Okay, so you may feel like there's been a lot of changes in the past 15 years or so, and it's true, and it is a strange time to be in ministry, and no doubt you feel the weight of some of those shifts. But we should also ask what hasn't changed, and I'll just mention a couple quickly. What hasn't changed is our responsibility to make disciples, the Great Commission. That's the first thing. Jesus said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him, and that we are to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them all that he has commanded. He didn't say until you get to the 21st century, and then it's just going to be too tough. For 2,000 years, that commission hasn't changed. And so there are cultural shifts that come. There are cultural winds that blow. Making disciples may get harder in some circumstances, but it still is our task. And another thing to remember, making disciples is always a supernatural thing. Making disciples is never easy. It's always a miracle. No one comes to faith because of some particular strategy. People come to faith because of the Spirit of the living God. So the task, that hasn't changed. The Spirit of God hasn't changed. Another thing that hasn't changed is God's love and purpose for the church. This is the one entity that transcends circumstances, that endures throughout different cultures. Now, listen, how we make disciples may shift. The way we think about making disciples, the way we seek to make disciples, some of our practices, some of our programs, some of the patterns may shift. And we shouldn't cling on to something just because it, worked really well in one era and assume that it's going to work the same in another era. There are aspects of this that will shift, but the call to make disciples does not change. And if we truly believe that Jesus was telling the truth when he said he will build his church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, then we need to consider, okay, all right, Lord, you're going to build your church. What's my role? What's my role in your plan of redemption? That's the question that we have. Okay, so next I want to, I'm going to shift gears. I want but before we start looking at some implications, I want to bust some myths that are out there. So take some data and bust some myths. So I hear different accounts from pastors across the country about what they're experiencing post-COVID, and there are some impressions out there. I'll run through a couple of them. Some have the impression that COVID radically sped up the trend of de-churching. That there was already a decline prior to 2020, and then a drop-off happened. We haven't been able to come back from that. I know a lot of churches that have not seen their numbers rebound to what they were before COVID. Maybe some of you in this room can relate to that. Another impression I hear from people is that they're concerned that in some cases online worship is seen as a substitute or is taking over the gathering with believers in person. This was one of the beautiful things about technology was during the pandemic. We were able to continue in some form worship services. You could see your pastor, you could see your worship leaders, you could maybe get on Zoom with your small group and be able to continue. Any time in human history up to this point when there had been a global pandemic like this, that would have been impossible. It would have been impossible. Now, the downside to that, I think, though, is that a lot of people have, I think, the perception today that the church is really content. It's the messages, it's the music, more content than it is the community of faith. If you can download the content by watching the worship service live or listening to the sermon on your podcast or connecting with people on an app, that will count as a substitute for in-person church gatherings. So I think there's that impression that we're concerned about that. But I want to just bust a couple of myths here, though, because the data doesn't always align with experience that you'll hear. So first of all, on the de-churching of America, COVID did not actually accelerate it. Not in any statistically significant way. There was a bit of a bigger drop there, obviously, in 2020, but not the extent that many people expected. Certainly not anything that really interrupts or changes this continual trajectory of decline that's already been going since 2000. So there's no cliff. But a lot of pastors almost think of COVID as this cliff because of anecdotal evidence. And anecdotal evidence is good, but it's just anecdotal. And I just want to give some explanation for why pastors may be feeling something that's not actually showing up in the surveys and the data itself. So here's a few of these. One is migration among churches. So when I hear from pastors, when they tell me their churches have not rebounded to where they were before, those impressions, I think they're true. The pastor's not saying something false there, but they actually point to a different phenomenon. And the bigger phenomenon is migration between churches. A lot of Christians have migrated to different churches than where they were 5 years ago. So some churches are stable in their attendance. Some have actually grown a bit. You see that especially in some of the larger churches. Other churches have declined. And I think one of the things that happened here, if I'm just going to try to make sense of what I hear from pastors and then what I see in the data, is you had this situation where suddenly people were watching online services, online worship services, at least for a few weeks, in some cases a couple months, depending on where you were. I know here in Florida, COVID never happened, right? I'm just kidding. But it was in some sense like fruit basket turnover. If you're familiar with that phrase, it's basically, it was a primed opportunity for church members to migrate or from one congregation to another. And this is happening all over the country. You'll have church members or you'll have people enjoying for a season the preaching and the music here. And then coming back to their own, their go-to congregation when they're in the mood for something more familiar. Or heading over to a third church to join up for a mission trip. It was basically, though, it was this opportunity. Everybody was at home, and people are asking different questions. Are we going to watch our church's live stream this week? Or are we going to attend church virtually through someone else's live stream? And any church in the country was available. And a church with dynamic or engaging preaching or that had an exceptionally well-produced, well-streamed worship service, some of those churches picked up people who were kind of already on the edges of their congregation. Probably not completely plugged in, just kind of on the periphery, of your congregation. They got picked up by other churches or wound up not going all together. So for the most part, the committed core members of a church stuck with the church through thick and thin, even through the pandemic. But many church members on the periphery weren't as connected as they appeared to be, maybe didn't feel a sense of community, weren't as loyal to the congregation as pastors may have expected. They migrated to a different faith community. And that shift has led some churches to grow or to remain stable. Other churches have declined. So part of what pastors are feeling is the effects of that migration. Now, please do not accept this, me saying this, or thinking through that like this is judgment on your congregation. Do not hear me saying, well, if you lost members through COVID, it's because you weren't being faithful or your preaching wasn't as good or something. No, the reality is, and this is true for all of us in here, we live in a consumeristic society. Whether we like it or not, people see the church in consumer terms. They do. And that's been happening for a long time, not just in the last few years. In the pandemic, though, everyone's church patterns and habits were put on pause, providing a prime opportunity for those kinds of shifts to happen, okay? So that's what's happening with migration among churches. But another thing that's happening, one of the reasons why the data doesn't align with the pastors is because the pastors are right and the data is wrong. And here's what I mean by this. It's decreasing frequency in church attendance. Another reason why many churches feel like their churches haven't rebounded is because Christians are still considering themselves faithful churchgoers, but they're attending less frequently than they did before. And so when the Christians are responding on the surveys about church attendance, this is where you'll find a discrepancy in the data. There are a lot of pastors who'll say, our numbers, we really haven't lost anyone that we know of, but our numbers still aren't what they were before COVID. And the reason is some of that could be migration, not always. The other reason is it's not migration. A lot of pastors, a lot of churches did not actually lose anyone at all. It's just the people in their congregations don't attend as often, but they still consider themselves church attenders. So, for example, someone 30 years ago who would have thought faithful church going is, I'm going to be there 3 times a week. They may consider themselves a faithful churchgoer if they make it there half the time now, twice a month, once a month even. And there will be people who will check a box on the survey of attending church in terms of their aspiration rather than their actual actions. Okay, so let's say there's someone who winds up sick. They wind up sick. Maybe they're battling cancer or something, immune disease, and they're not able to get to church for 6 months. That person's still going to consider themselves a regular church member, right? Because they would be attending if they could. Like that's how they see themselves. But there are lots of other people who don't have a health excuse that are healthy, who are the same way. They may be gone for 3 months doing travel ball every single Sunday and still consider themselves faithful churchgoers because that's how they see themselves. Right? So it's this aspirational understanding. It's their self-perception rather than it is actually their reality. So this is one of the aspects that we are dealing with as well, which I think we need to keep in mind means that our opportunities for discipleship are decreasing as well, corporately, together in community. So the studies do show larger churches are getting a little bigger, smaller churches are getting a little smaller. I think that's part of where I just want to put this anecdotal evidence into context. One other myth, though, a myth. Well, I've got a couple more that I want to mention. One of the online church fear that online is going to replace or take over church. There is that impression that people are no longer seeing the gathering as optional. They're fine with downloading podcasts or watching the live stream or whatnot. The good news is most people, when asked, say they prefer physical gathering when they talk about church. For the most part, people still see online worship as it's a supplement, it's not a substitute. So that's good news. But I do think I just want to dig in here, though, and just stimulate some thinking about this, because this is a cultural touch point that we need to be aware of. There is something to be said here about this wider trend in our society of us viewing ourselves in digitalized terms more broadly. And what I mean by that is because of how much time we spend today receiving and communicating information, right? Receiving information, broadcasting ourselves to others. All of us are like this. We are constantly trying on identities online. This is happening, we say, well, this is happening especially with young people. I mean, have you not seen grandma with the iPhone? It's not a generational thing. Like everybody is figuring out how to grapple with these, this sort of new digital world that we're in. And at some level, everybody is rethinking themselves and how they present online. We are trying on online identities. We are concerned about how other people will view us. And so for a lot of people, church is more of a badge that says something about how we see ourselves and how we present ourselves in many cases. So this is one of the things, it's been interesting to me to see the rise of the photo booth at church, especially on special occasions. And I think it's a really great idea to get, especially for those who don't come to church as often, because you want people seeing themselves as belonging to a church and wanting to present this vision. But the photo booth idea, like 30, 40 years ago, would not have really been a thing, but it is today. Why? Because of the way we are viewing ourselves through the digital lens of how people are perceiving us. Do you see? So that's one aspect of this we just have to be aware of. People are wearing the church as a badge. And another thing to mention about this is what I mentioned before, is that we tend to think of the church as content rather than community. As the downloading of content from, the preacher, expert, TED Talk kind of person, his brain to your brain, right? Or it's about, as long as you can watch the video or listen to the podcast, that's good or almost as good as actually being at church. And so this is decreasing the ability to really see the church as a place of deep friendship, of close connection, of community that goes beyond just helping us with our needs, but is also part of what it means to walk with Jesus, where we're with people who will not just inspire us or edify us or encourage us, but also will exhort us to love and good deeds and Christ-likeness. So that's an aspect. There's another myth that is out there, though, connected to this, and that's the idea that the optional church is something new. I just want to say the idea that the church is optional is not, it didn't just show up in the last 5 years. It's actually been reflected in statistics and surveys for a long time. And some of this we may have actually caused ourselves accidentally. I want to be careful that I don't cast judgment on previous generations, but back in the cultural Christianity of the 1950s and 60s, church going really spiked in the 50s and 60s. It was like, it was sort of America over against the godless communists. Dwight Eisenhower actually was baptized as president, which is fascinating. It's when we added in God We Trust to we made it our national motto. It's when we added it to under God to the pledge. So all of that's happening in the 50s and 60s. And one of the things that evangelists and pastors and teachers did during that time was to want to differentiate, rightly I think, between cultural Christianity, church going, and actual being born again believing Christians who had actually had a personal relationship with Jesus. And so you would have people in the 50s and 60s and 70s say things like, going to church doesn't make you a Christian, which is true, and it was the right move at the time. But that, as the cultural shift from the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s to today, that truth planted in a different cultural context got heard differently. And instead of it being going to church doesn't make you a Christian, what got heard eventually was to be a Christian, you don't necessarily have to go to church. And so you see this in the statistics in salvation. 10 years ago, this is before COVID, only 35% of professing Christians in the United States said church going is an essential part of the Christian life. Only 35%. So it's optional for a lot of people. People look at the church as helping, like the purpose of the church is to help me along in my spiritual life as I see it myself. That's what the church is there for. If it helps me, great. If it doesn't, I'm good on my own. That's how people see the church. So, during COVID, we saw the best of the church. We also saw some of that superficiality come out as well. There's one other myth that I haven't mentioned yet that I just want to throw out there, and it's the idea that the church is in decline because we're losing our kids when they go to college. Secularization is happening at college. It's creeping back into Christian families. We're losing a lot of our young people when they go to college. Listen, the stats do show, they're not pretty, a lot of the stats that are shown about this, but I'm going to give you even more depressing news. We're losing our young people when they're in high school. It's not college. They're checking out when they're 16 and 17. So that disengagement is already happening in a lot of places. So we'll come back to this in a little bit. So what are some implications then for a post-COVID world? Well, one of the things we've got to recognize is the way that people in our society think of spiritual formation is they think of the family before they think of the church. And we've got to recognize that is the reality of the cultural landscape that we're in. Whether it's right or wrong, that's where we're at. So I want to take everything we've just talked about and start to apply it. And the first thing I want to leave us with is this understanding that one of the major shifts we've got to make as church leaders because of where we are culturally is we've got to equip the household for disciple making to take place in the household. If most people in our society see the home rather than the church as the primary place for spiritual formation, which again, whether or not that's right or wrong, that's how people see it, then we have got to make sure we are not over-relying, and I know as pastors, as preachers, we can do this. We spend a lot of time preparing messages, preparing sermons, for the Sunday morning experience to be as wonderful as it can be. That's fantastic. We should. It's the worship of the Almighty God we're talking about. But we shouldn't over-rely on our program and our preaching to do the work of discipleship when there are 6 other days of the week where discipleship, if it's not taking place, the 1 hour a week is rarely going to compete. There's an interesting book from Christian Smith and Amy Adamczyk called Handing Down the Faith that details these differences between families who are successful in handing down the faith and those who are not. And this is not it's not from a Christian perspective book, but it's basically they're trying to figure out how does a family that is responsible for passing down the faith, what is it that they're handing down? So this is the kind of the sad thing about the book, is that even in the cases where the family hands down the faith that the parents have, it's not always Orthodox Christianity. A lot of times it's more of a, religion is a source of stability. It's a grounding. It's a moral ballast. It's to help you live a successful life as defined by 21st century America. So sometimes the faith that parents think they're handing down to their kids and may actually be successful in transmitting is not the faith once for all delivered to the saints. They're passing down some good values, but it may not always be true Christianity. And I think we've got to reckon with that. But the takeaway from this research and this book is that still the family matters more than the congregation as to whether or not some kind of faith gets passed down at all. And so that makes me think, okay, then as churches, we need to be thinking, what are we doing to help families do that better? What are we doing to equip the household to be a place of robust faith? How we answer that question is going to make a difference. And we want the household not to be a shallow faith that's handing down, but a substantive faith that's being handed down. So we've got to ask that question. Some of you may know J.D. Greer has said it for a long time. At the Summit Church, they have this line. It's one of their plumb lines. They say every pastor is a missions pastor. Because every pastor is about the mission, right? That's like what one of their plumb lines is to say, we don't cordon off mission from the rest of what we're doing. And I love that quote. But here's something I would just leave you with as a challenge. What if we extended that analogy out and you basically, every person on staff in your church saw themselves as a family discipleship pastor at some level? Like whether or not their title is senior adults, whether their title is youth pastor, whether their title, whatever it might be, student ministry, kids minister, whatever it might be. But they were thinking whole family, Whole family discipleship. Not just experience on Sunday morning, experience on a Wednesday night, a great VBS, a great student ministry program, great sermon on Sunday, but you even as a pastor in your preaching would be asking the question, how am I as a family discipleship pastor going to go about doing my primary calling in this congregation? So we've got to ask that question. How are we helping parents, grandparents, older siblings pass down the faith? So that's one question. I'm going to show another book here, Nothing Less. It came from Lifeway Research. Jana Magruder compiled some data. And it's a fascinating Lifeway research study that showed, okay, because you hear everyone leaves the church. We're losing our kids, Okay, so they did some studies to say, what were the practices that were common in the lives of children who stayed in church, believing Christians, all the way through their 20s. Like they never fell away and came back, they were just there. And what they found were a number of spiritual practices. I'll show you the list here. There's a list of several, 10 categories, spiritual influences. And the first five were definitely the biggest ones. Bible reading, like where they read the Bible on their own, number one. If you've got a teenager who reads the Bible on their own, the likelihood that they will remain in the church through college and beyond is way higher than any other statistic. The correlation is massive here. And of course, I think we would all understand why. The Bible is God's word. It's food. I mean, a lot of our, without the Bible, our kids are anemic and they're starving. So Bible on their own, that was the number one. Prayer, obviously, is big. Individual prayer on their own. Service, which is interesting. It's not just church attendance, it's serving in the church. And this is key here. The earlier you get kids and teenagers serving in the church with roles that matter, the more likely they are to stay in church. So not thinking of what's the experience that's going to draw these kids in, and I got to keep them with, but asking the question, how do I involve kids in the church to help make the church what the church is going to be? Service is there. And then I love the fact that music is number 4. I would have thought other things would have been higher than this, but listening predominantly to Christian music as teenagers is correlated with remaining in the faith. Now, I don't know exactly what all that means or represents, but I think there's something to be true about this. Everybody in this room, I guarantee it, if you were to listen to a song from your senior year in high school that was popular, 20 years later, 30 years later, you'd know all the words. Isn't that the case? Even though it's hard to learn new songs, I don't know about you, but it's harder and harder for me to learn new songs the older I get. There's something about the impressionable years of 10 to 20 or so where the what we're singing, what we're learning gets into our hearts. Augustine said, we sing the faith into our hearts. And so the more we can prioritize and promote good Christian music with our kids, where the more likely their faith is to be fortified. So yes, programs matter, and in the church we focus a lot on programs, Vacation Bible School, youth group activities, Sunday school, whatever. But listen, those programs are not on that list. Those programs make the biggest impact when they are combined with that list. So what I'm hoping, if there's a shift in the thinking in here, it's, okay, how do we create the culture of the home to be with that list and then bring our programs alongside to help fortify that list? So the culture of the home. Okay, another couple of things and then we'll be done. We're going to have a little bit of time for some Q&A. Another thing that I think we need to be thinking about is the pursuit of Christian education. Jimmy Scroggins and I are working on an initiative in the coming months where basically we're encouraging all pastors in the convention to start thinking like parish priests in the 1850s during the years of anti-Catholic bigotry in the U.S. One of the ways Catholics preserved an identity in the United States when virtually all of America was Protestant, dead set against any sort of Catholic identity, was through education. Was through parish schools, neighborhood churches. They got their kids into Catholic education. It's one of the ways Catholicism flourished in a pretty hostile environment. Now, we are living in a time right now, the cultural winds are turning in such a direction, we are going to be increasingly at odds with basic fundamental values in our society. And you're seeing this all over the country, even in red states. I mean, I've talked to church planters who are really concerned because they're winding up, in places that they were not expecting it. Suddenly, fourth and fifth grade kids learning about the gender unicorn, and just other aspects of gender identity that go way beyond what the Bible teaches about marriage. Also just what it means to be human, made male and female in the image of God, So those are some aspects, those are some of the pinch points. But the reason why I think the education component has at least got to be on the topic of conversation is that we need to be thinking, and we need to think in terms of outreach. How do we serve our neighborhoods when it comes to education of kids? Not just how do I serve my church with the education of our kids, but how is our neighborhood and community served by education in terms of outreach? So I'm not talking about some sort of Benedict option retreat from the culture. There are a lot of non-Christians or maybe nominal Christians in your neighborhood who don't really know a lot about the Bible, but they know enough to not want their kids to be indoctrinated into all sorts of things they think are going to cause moral chaos in their lives. And they don't even know how to express their concern or where they should go. Listen, our moral sanity has the opportunity of being one of the biggest attraction points for our culture in the next 50 years, not one of the biggest turnoffs. So, I mean, when you watch contemporary culture detaching from reality in certain areas, you can think of it in terms of, I want to shield my kids from that. Great. But we also had to think of what does education with God at the center actually look like? So if you have inherited a church with a lot of education space that sits unused all throughout the week, why not consider hosting that space, for a micro school of 20, 25 kids, or a homeschool co-op, or figuring out, maybe partnering with another church in town, like doing some kind of Christian education through the week or a Christian school. Now, I know I'm saying this and it scares the living daylights out of some pastors because they're thinking, wait a minute. I can't imagine the difficulties of trying to run a Christian school and a church at the same time, to which I say yes and amen, and you should not have to do that. You shouldn't want to do that. Your primary calling is to the church, but there are ways to set up a Christian school or to allow your space to be used that will not be a drain on the church, but would actually be an opportunity to get people from your neighborhood in your parking lot and in your facilities every single week. It's suddenly a way for your church to be like a hub for the neighborhood. This is where the Catholics were great in the 1850s and the late 1800s. This is where they wound up being able to actually flourish in a time when the culture was against them. And so I would just say, if there's a shift in your thinking, it should be this. Think of Christian education as Christian school, not as a distraction from your discipleship, but as an extension of your discipleship. And I'm not saying there needs to be some mass exodus from the public schools, or that every public school teacher that's a Christian should give up their job, should teach at a Christian school instead, or that every Christian kid should be going there. There are all kinds of challenges, cultural complexities in that regard. People's callings are different. Christian schooling right now is not affordable for most Christian families, and so that's one of the things we've got to figure out is what would it look like if it were more affordable, especially as school choice is on the rise and you're seeing vouchers and you're seeing all sorts of things take place. But I will say a lot of Christian schools have waiting lists already, and I'm just going to throw it out there on the table for discussion that it's got to be on the table when we talk about discipling the next generation. Okay, a couple last things. prioritize people over programs. This is an implication of post-COVID. If you're waiting for the next program that's going to come out of Lifeway or North American Mission Board or whatever as the silver bullet for discipleship, you're going to be waiting for a long time. Culturally, things are more complex than they've been before, and people resist one-size-fits-all approaches anyway. One of the best things that could happen is if we, as the church, figure out how to create and cultivate and sustain deep relationships again. Because in our society, people are losing the ability to do that in this digital era. So getting people into each other's homes as much as possible. Hospitality, I mean, it starts right there. Bringing people in who are interested in the faith, one-on-one, doing discipleship the old-fashioned way where you're not relying on a program as the silver bullet, but you're simply modeling and walking with other people through the Christian faith. This is what our society craves, even if they don't know that this is what they need. So we got to go for the people right in front of us. People over programs. Vitally important. And then one last thing I would mention is if you're part of a larger church here, a mega church, if you're over 500 or 1,000 people and you have a lot of resources, you need to remember what Jesus says about to whom much is given, much is required. So I would encourage you to think of the larger church as a cathedral that help other congregations in the parish. So if you're a bigger church, instead of seeing other churches, smaller churches that are nestled in different neighborhoods and whatnot, start thinking, how can we be the hub that is able to resource and help these smaller churches all across the way? We don't need to see all these smaller neighborhood churches, some of them that are in decline or plateaued. We don't need to see them closing. We need to see them reinvigorated. One of the best ways that can happen is not from the bigger church necessarily going in and making that a campus, but from the bigger church simply figuring out how do we get resources into different neighborhoods that can help them to grow and become a little oasis in the neighborhoods where God has planted them. So this is a recommendation that my friend Jake Meador has made. He's written about this. Basically, think of yourself, if you're in a larger church, as a place of resourcing for smaller neighborhood churches that are all around. And I realize to think of yourself like a cathedral, it's going to take a level of collaboration, shared resources. It's going to take a level of partnership that we're not as acquainted with in the SBC, but I think it's going to be essential for the days ahead. If we want if we want the decline of churches to stop and to be turned around, we are going to have to figure out how we lock arms and in unusual ways, different ways that are not necessarily all cookie cutter, figure out how do we use the resources that God has given us to then bless the churches around us. And that means we'll have to see ourselves in collaboration, not as competitors. And in a consumeristic society, that is not easy. It's not easy. But that's where we'll have to get if we want to see the church strengthened. So overall, we're in a new era. De-churching is taking place across the country, secularizing environment. The mission is the same. And I would just say the church is always in crisis and the church is always stable. The church has been in crisis all the way back to the very beginning. I mean, look at Corinth. If that wasn't a church in crisis, I don't know what was. And I still am a little bit baffled by churches that name themselves after Corinth. It's almost like, could you not do Philippi or some other church? No, I mean, Corinth, the guy who's like sleeping with his mother-in-law, they're all divided, Apollos, they're getting drunk at the Lord's table. That is a lot of those little cups, you know what I mean? So, it's a mess. And yet Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church. So we should not succumb to fruitless anxiety when it comes to the future of the church. We are in a battle, yes, but the outcome is secure because Jesus has told us that it is. So yes, the church is in crisis. Yes, the church also is stable. And we need to keep both of those truths in mind as we seek to be faithful. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob. He's got a microphone and we'll be able to do a little bit of interaction and Q&A for at least a little bit of time here.
Let's take 10 or 15 minutes for some Q&A. Any questions? And I'll try to get to you so we can have a microphone. Yeah. But
I can start. As you're talking about the significance of passing the faith on, is there anything you've seen work really, really well in churches? I wrote down maybe 2 pages of things that we are not doing that I could see my daughter having a place in that mimics what we have in groups, in classes, and studies. Have you seen anything like that in a church for kids that you've said, wow, that's a good idea, that works really well?
No, I haven't. I mean, I've seen obviously different curriculum options, and there are all sorts of things like that. But I don't think of any particular thing where it's like, this is what appears to be taking off as like a particular program or something that's going off everywhere. What I do see, though, and this is important, you don't walk away from this talk on the family discipleship component and think you have to do everything. Like we're not, if you got 2 pages of things where you don't feel like you're doing well, the likelihood is you're not going to succeed at doing 2 full pages of things really well. The important thing would be to find 2 or 3 that reinforce each other, that you think your church is particularly gifted at, and lean in deep into that and do that as well as you can. And then, keep your eyes open to other things that other churches may be doing where you think, I think we could implement that, or we could. I think that's going to be the approach. It's not that all of those things on that list, there's a particular thing for all of those to happen. It's what you want is you want to get the people in your congregation with their particular skills and giftings to figure out where can we have the biggest impact, and then see what works and what doesn't, as far as, look at it over 2, 3, 4 years and see what's working, and then be ready to try new things if particular things are not. That would be my suggestion.
You talked about the church as a cathedral, the larger churches. Was there any practical things that either a larger church could help or that the smaller church could ask for? Like, have you seen that work well in scenarios or anything?
So I am seeing this happen in some different places here and there. It's really interesting because there was a time when it was all church planting, and then it was like it's all revitalization, and then it was church, bigger churches, kind of doing campuses in smaller locations. What I'm seeing now is a lot more variety. All of those things are still happening, but what you're finding is, in some cases, the smaller churches are asking for help from the larger churches because they'll wind up at a place, for example, where a pastor moves away or retires, and they can't afford a full-time pastor. And then they're like, what do? We don't want to close. We've got, you have like 30 to 40 people. They're trying to figure out. So they may ask a larger church. You can ask a larger church for teaching help. You can ask a larger church for, sometimes the larger church will ask, is there anyone, do we have a couple of families in this church that would go and help? Some of these smaller churches don't have really a kids ministry at all because they don't have any kids to minister to. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we attract young families? We're in this spiral where we're aging, we don't know how to reach, we don't want our doors to shut, how do we? So basically asking for advice and suggestions from the larger church, and then seeing if there's help. Sometimes it's financial, but sometimes it's in terms of preaching, teaching people, that is where just in a congregation that's dwindled to about 25 people, 2 families can affect a massive cultural change in a small church. It really can. And so you can begin to see the tide shift over time if just little things like that are able to take place. Some of these churches have enough money to be able to keep the facilities going okay. They're okay. They're not sure they can afford a pastor on a full-time salary, or they don't have, so they're in that in-between stage. And this is where the larger church can become a place of resources. That's what I'm seeing in particular cases.
You mentioned earlier getting our young people involved in significant ministry. What would be examples of significant roles versus not so significant roles?
Yeah, when I say significant, I think anytime you're turning over, there's a book called Growing Young, which is about churches that have done well. They talk about key chain leadership, meaning you hand over the keys. To where, when I mean significant, I mean that there's a significant level of responsibility. So if it's young people that are making parts of the worship service happen, they're the ones running the PowerPoint. They need to change the slide on the last word of the song, of the stanza you're singing. I will say, if anyone runs a PowerPoint, please, for the love of all that is holy, please change the PowerPoint then. Change to the next slide. Don't wait until the next line, because people will not be able to follow along in singing. Sorry, it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. If you're going to let teenagers do that, train them well, please. No, but let teenagers do, there are all sorts of places where we need to be asking the question, could a young person do this? And if so, why aren't they? Why don't we, young people can be greeters, they can be ushers, young people can be part of the food pantry that you're doing, young people can be part of can be engaged in mission trips and whatnot. We've got to stop thinking of young people as the church of the future. They are the church now. And so the more we get them involved, and it's all sorts of things. So it's not significant versus insignificant, meaning, this really matters and this doesn't. What I mean when I talk about significance is that you're actually, where they feel like if I don't show up at church, that doesn't get done this week. That makes a big difference, because then they've got ownership. They're not just coming to the party or to the show. They're coming because they're part of it. They're in the choir. They're in the worship band. They're playing the drums. They're running the sound booth, the sound system. They're doing the PowerPoint.
What are some churches that you're seeing that are doing a really good job of reaching unchurched and dechurched people? What are some things that they're doing well?
Yeah, so among churches that I feel like do well with unchurched people, newer churches tend to do better with unchurched people, because this is the reality. There are a lot of people in our congregations who would be more evangelistic if they had more lost friends. But the problem is, the more that they are connected into the community of faith, the longer they go from the time they get saved, the more their friend group changes, and so they wind up not. Their connections are not as much with lost people as it might have been. It's not a bad thing. It just is a thing. It just is what it is. So typically newer churches, this is why newer church plants tend to baptize more people from a percentage standpoint than established churches. It's because a lot of the people that come to faith in a newer church tend to also then have friend pools from which evangelism happens, and that begins to happen. So typically, newer churches excel at that. One of the ways established churches that I've seen are able to help with the de-churched is to recognize that there are a lot of people who are de-churched, not because they've been harmed by the church, or they're hurt by the church, or they had a bad experience in the church. They just moved, or they went through a divorce, or they got a new job on a different side of town, or they don't even consider themselves, they basically have just fallen out of the habit. Established churches with good programs, sometimes all it takes is a couple of invitations to bring de-churched, that segment of de-churched. And that is the largest segment of de-churched. We talk about this in that episode I was talking about, episode 2 of the season of Reconstructing Faith, is a lot of times we think, because all of the headlines are people who walked away from the church because they were mad about something, or they didn't like the doctrine, or they didn't like the politics, or they got hurt by an abusive, toxic leadership environment or whatever. That is a segment. That's a very loud segment, but it is not the majority. The majority of people in the last 20 years who have left the church have drifted away from the church. And many of them are ready to come back. So established churches can do really well at re-engaging sort of nominal de-churched people that really just need to have their faith reignited.
One more question.
You use the phrase culture of the home. Now, this is kind of the space I'm in, because Mary Eberstadt's book, I don't know if you've heard of that book, I've read it, but it's
Which one? How the West Lost God?
How the West Really Lost God,
Yeah.
which is a new theory on secularization,
Right.
that marriage and Christianity are linked together.
Yes.
The breakdown of the family throughout world history leads to decrease of Christianity,
Yes.
decrease Christianity, breakdown the family. And the reality is, the typical family in America is broken and emotionally disconnected.
Yeah.
And they go to the church where we're not connecting. their content versus community. So we have modeled the family. So if we're going to do something different, then we've got to become an organization that actually teaches people to mature in love so they can love maturely back home.
Yeah.
And if we can move to that level, then I think we'll see a massive impact in community transformation because the culture is looking for it. And when you look, and you talked about how we moved from politics being religious.
Yes.
If people are, according to her, because she talks about that, they're moving there because religion's gone. So they move to these religious systems, but what they're finding is community.
Yeah.
In that fervency.
Yes.
It's just another form of church community in a very unhealthy way in my mind.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned her. I'm having her on the podcast in a couple of weeks to talk about that. So, again, this is a particular challenge. I'm not sure I've figured. I'm still wrestling with this. So, yes, marriage and the stability of the family. When that decreases, secularization increases, and then vice versa. It's like a vicious cycle, and we're in it right now. I think she's spot on about that. The question is, then what does the church do in the wake of that kind of family breakdown? And here's a question I've been wrestling with for like 10 years. What does it mean to tell a person in China that they are a brother and sister with everyone in their congregation when most people in China only have one-child families? The concept of brother and sister is different. So what do you do? Okay, so now extrapolate that out for us. What do you do when Paul uses all these family metaphors, and yet we don't have stable families for them to rely on to know what that means? So we have to do two things at the same time. The church has to figure out how to strengthen families, just in general, strengthen families, while also the strength of the family is what makes the church be able to be a family, because those relationships, learning how to treat your mother, your father, your sibling, your extended family, knowing all of that matters for this. And so it's a huge challenge, and we're not going to solve it in this Q&A, but it's one I've been thinking about a lot, so I'm glad you mentioned that.
Can we give it up for Trevin?